It was an ordinary Thursday afternoon. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a warm glow over the small town. People were going about their business, the usual sounds of life filling the streets. The chatter of children playing, the hum of passing cars, and the distant buzz of a lawnmower trimming grass. Everything seemed peaceful, nothing out of the ordinary. But for one man, everything was about to change in an instant. His name was Daniel Miller. He was a quiet, ordinary man. He worked a 9-to-5 job in a small office downtown. Every morning, he woke up at 7 a.m., had a cup of coffee, and went to work. After work, he liked to walk around the park near his house, enjoying the fresh air before heading home to relax with a book or watch TV. It wasn't the most exciting life, but Daniel liked it that way. He liked to keep to himself, avoiding trouble, and staying out of the spotlight. That afternoon, Daniel had decided to take a short walk before dinner. The weather was nice, and he felt like clearing his mind after a long day at work. He walked along the quiet street, hands in his pockets, enjoying the calm. He passed the usual stores. There was Mrs. Carter's bakery on the corner, the old hardware store where Mr. Thompson worked, and the small newsstand run by a friendly old man named Mr. Lee. All familiar sights, nothing that stood out. But then, as he reached the end of the block, something unusual happened. The sound of sirens suddenly filled the air. At first, Daniel didn't think much of it. Sirens were common in the city, but as he turned the corner, he saw something that made his heart race. 2 police cars had pulled up on the street, their lights flashing brightly. A group of officers had stepped out, their eyes scanning the area. They were looking for someone, but Daniel had no idea why they were here or what was happening. His first instinct was to keep walking, to avoid drawing attention to himself. But before he could take another step, one of the officers approached him quickly. "Sir, please stop," the officer said firmly. Daniel froze, confusion clouding his mind. "Is there a problem, officer?" The officer didn't answer right away. He simply looked at Daniel with a serious expression, as though he was searching for something. The officer seemed to hesitate for a moment, but then he spoke again, his voice cold and commanding. "We need you to come with us." Daniel blinked, taken aback. "What's going on? Why do you need me to come with you?" The officer didn't respond. Instead, he motioned for Daniel to step towards the police car. His tone left no room for argument. Daniel's heart began to beat faster, panic creeping in. He was just a regular guy. He hadn't done anything wrong. Why were they asking him to go with them? "Is there a mistake?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling slightly. The officer didn't say anything. He simply nodded at the other officers, who moved quickly to surround Daniel, their eyes fixed on him. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. Daniel stood there, frozen, not sure what to do. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. It was as if everything around him had shifted, and he was suddenly caught in a nightmare. The officers didn't explain anything. They just kept urging him toward the police car, and Daniel felt a sense of helplessness growing inside him. He tried to look around, but there was no one nearby. The street seemed emptier than usual, and the few people who were around seemed to be avoiding eye contact. The whole scene felt strange, unreal, like something out of a movie. But this was real, and Daniel had no idea why this was happening. He wanted to ask more questions, to demand an explanation, but every time he opened his mouth, the officers simply pointed to the car and told him to get in. The authority in their voices left him with no choice but to obey. His mind was spinning as he climbed into the back of the police car, his hands shaking slightly. The door slammed shut behind him, and the car started moving. The officers didn't say a word during the ride. Daniel sat there in silence, his mind racing. What did they think he had done? He had no criminal record, no history of trouble with the law. He was just a normal man living a quiet life. But why had they detained him like this? Why were they treating him like a criminal? The car made several turns, and Daniel tried to get a sense of where they were going, but the route seemed unfamiliar. The city streets blurred past the window, and the tension in the air seemed to grow thicker with every minute. It felt like hours had passed, but it was only a short ride. Finally, the car came to a stop. The officers opened the door, and one of them motioned for Daniel to step out. "Come on," the officer said, still not giving any explanation. "Let's go inside." Daniel stepped out, still in a daze, and was led into the police station. His legs felt heavy, and his mind was racing. What had just happened? Why had they arrested him? Was this all some sort of mistake? As the doors of the station closed behind him, Daniel had a sinking feeling in his stomach. He didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change. His life, which had been so simple and peaceful just hours ago, was now on a path he could never have imagined. And the strange, silent officers who had taken him from the street had no idea just how big a mistake they were about to make. Daniel sat quietly in the back of the police car, staring out of the small window. The sound of the sirens seemed to echo in his mind, even though they were now turned off. The streets of the city passed by in a blur, and Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He tried to make sense of everything, but his thoughts were a jumbled mess. His heart was still racing from the shock of the arrest, and his mind kept spinning in circles. "Why am I here?" he thought. "What did I do wrong?" His eyes flicked to the two officers sitting in the front seat, their faces hidden in the rearview mirror. They hadn't said a word to him since they'd told him to get in the car. Daniel had tried asking questions, but each time they ignored him or gave him a cold, distant look. It was as if they didn't even care enough to respond. The silence in the car was deafening. The only sound was the soft hum of the engine as the car sped down the road, its tires scraping against the pavement. The streets outside seemed to stretch on forever, but time itself felt like it had come to a standstill. Daniel tried to think back to earlier that day, to see if he had done anything that could have triggered this, but there was nothing. It was an ordinary Thursday. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened. He had walked to the park for his usual evening stroll. Nothing more. Yet, here he was, trapped in the back of a police car, with no explanation. It made no sense. Why had they detained him? He wasn't a criminal. He had no history with the law. He had never been in trouble. So why? Why now? Why him? Is there something wrong? Daniel asked, his voice shaking. He couldn't take the silence anymore. The anxiety was eating away at him, and he needed some kind of answer, something to hold on to. But the officers didn't answer. They didn't even acknowledge his question. Daniel's stomach churned with frustration. He felt completely helpless, trapped in a situation where no one would tell him anything. The silence between him and the officers was becoming unbearable, and with each passing second, the mystery deepened. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and still, the car didn't stop. Daniel tried to distract himself by looking out the window again. The familiar buildings of the city seemed to be getting farther away, and the streets were becoming less populated. Where were they taking him? His mind was racing with worst-case scenarios. Maybe they were taking him somewhere remote, somewhere he'd never be able to escape. A sudden thought hit him like a ton of bricks. What if this wasn't a mistake? What if they thought he was someone else? He'd heard of mistaken identity before. But what if it wasn't a mistake? What if they thought he was a criminal or a suspect in something serious? His mind spiraled with possibilities, none of them good. But even in his panic, Daniel couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. He had watched enough crime dramas on TV to know that when people were arrested, they were usually told what they were being charged with, at least in some way. But not him. No one had even told him why he was being detained, and it made no sense. His gut told him that something was wrong, something more than just a simple mix-up. The car took another turn, and Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The scenery outside had changed again. The buildings were now fewer and farther apart, and the streets were starting to look unfamiliar. He couldn't tell where they were going, but the tight knot in his chest was growing tighter with every mile. He had to do something. He had to try to get answers. "Excuse me." Daniel raised his voice, his frustration finally breaking through. "Can someone please tell me what's going on?" This time, one of the officers turned his head slightly, but not enough to make eye contact. He glanced at Daniel through the rearview mirror, his face expressionless. Then, without a word, he turned back to the road, as though Daniel hadn't even spoken. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had never felt more invisible in his life. His voice seemed to mean nothing to them. It was as if he was just a passenger in his own life, drifting through this strange, unexplainable situation. The feeling of isolation was suffocating. No one cared enough to tell him why he was there. No one cared enough to explain. He sat back in his seat, hands trembling in his lap. His mind raced through possible explanations. Had he been mistaken for someone else? Maybe they thought he was connected to something illegal, or was it a case of identity theft? Was he a victim in this situation? The thoughts were endless, and none of them helped. The more he thought about it, the more confused he became. The ride continued, the car moving further and further away from the center of the city. Daniel couldn't help but wonder what would happen when they finally arrived at their destination. Would he be taken to a holding cell? Would they lock him up without giving him an explanation? The silence in the car felt almost suffocating. It was as though the officers were deliberately avoiding any kind of conversation, refusing to even acknowledge his presence. The lack of information was maddening. Every minute that passed without an answer felt like an eternity. The longer they kept him in the dark, the more his anxiety grew. Then, just as Daniel thought he couldn't take the silence any longer, the car came to a sudden stop. The abrupt halt jolted him forward in his seat. He looked up, his eyes widening in surprise as he realized they had arrived at a place he didn't recognize. The car door opened, and one of the officers gestured for him to get out. Daniel hesitated for a moment, still unsure of what was going on. But then he climbed out of the car, his legs feeling weak beneath him. The building in front of him was large and imposing, a concrete structure with barred windows. It looked like a prison or some kind of detention center. His heart sank. He was being taken to a place where they could hold him indefinitely. And still, no one had told him why. The officer gave him a firm shove forward. "Come on," he said, his voice cold and detached. "Let's go inside." Daniel took a deep breath and followed, his mind still in a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He had no idea what was going to happen next, but one thing was certain: his life was never going to be the same again. Daniel's mind raced as he was ushered into the building, his heart pounding in his chest. The moment he stepped through the heavy steel doors, he felt a cold, unsettling chill wash over him. The station smelled sterile, like old wood mixed with the sharp scent of disinfectant. The walls were lined with dull gray tiles, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, adding to the eerie atmosphere. The officer who had been in the car with him led him down a narrow hallway. Daniel's footsteps echoed loudly in the empty corridor, amplifying the silence that had settled around them. His head was spinning, his thoughts chaotic and confused. What was happening? Why was he here? Every moment felt heavier than the last. He glanced around, trying to make sense of his surroundings. He passed a few closed doors, each marked with a number. There were no signs explaining what was going on, no one else in sight. It was like he was being led to some unknown destination, with no answers in sight. The officer stopped in front of a door, then turned to face Daniel. "Wait here," the officer said flatly. "I'll be back in a minute." Daniel nodded, his throat dry. He wasn't sure if he was supposed to speak, but he was too anxious to stay silent. "Are you going to tell me why I'm here?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. But the officer didn't respond. He simply gave Daniel a cold look and walked away, disappearing down the hallway. Daniel stood there, staring at the door in front of him. His mind was still a storm of questions. Had they found something on him? Was he being accused of something he didn't even know about? The longer he stood there, the more the uncertainty gnawed at him. The silence in the hall was suffocating, and the weight of it pressed down on him, making it feel like the walls were closing in. He didn't know how long he stood there, but it felt like forever. Every second felt like a lifetime as he waited for the officer to return. His hands were trembling in his pockets, and his mind couldn't stop running in circles. Maybe they were just processing him, or maybe it was something worse. Maybe they had already decided he was guilty of something. But just as the tension was becoming unbearable, the door behind him creaked open. Daniel turned, his heart jumping in his chest, but it wasn't the officer returning. A new figure stepped into the room. The man was tall, wearing a dark suit and carrying a folder in his hand. His expression was serious, his eyes cold, and there was something unsettling about the way he looked at Daniel. He didn't smile, didn't introduce himself. He just stepped forward and sat behind a desk, laying the folder down in front of him. Daniel's nerves flared. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Why am I here?" The man didn't answer at first. Instead, he flipped open the folder, his fingers quickly skimming through the papers inside. For a moment, Daniel felt like he was invisible. It was as if the man didn't even hear him. "Do you know why you're here, Daniel?" the man finally asked, looking up from the folder. His voice was calm, methodical, but there was an undertone of something that Daniel couldn't place. Daniel's heart skipped. How did he know his name? "I don't know why I'm here," Daniel exclaimed, his voice rising in frustration. "I haven't done anything wrong. I don't know why you've arrested me, or why you're not telling me anything." The man's eyes narrowed slightly, and he set the folder down on the desk with a soft thud. "You haven't done anything wrong, you say?" he said in a low, almost amused voice. "Then why don't you explain why we found your name on a list we were investigating?" Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. "What list? What are you talking about?" The man leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together. "A very important list," he replied coolly. "One that connects you to a series of high-profile criminal activities. Now, don't play innocent. We know who you are, Daniel." Daniel froze. A series of criminal activities. What was this man talking about? He was just a regular guy. He didn't know anyone involved in anything illegal. This had to be a mistake. He had no idea how his name could be connected to such things. The thought made his stomach turn. "Do wait," Daniel stammered, trying to make sense of the situation. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not involved in any crime. There's been some mistake, I swear." The man looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and disdain. "The mistake, Daniel, is believing you can lie your way out of this." He opened the folder, revealing a stack of documents. He shuffled through the papers slowly, allowing the tension to build between them. Then he pulled out a piece of paper and slid it across the desk toward Daniel. Daniel hesitated for a moment before reaching out to take the paper. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the contents quickly. The letter was official-looking, stamped with a government seal, and it seemed to be a summary of an investigation, with his name listed as a person of interest. His heart pounded as he read through the words. He couldn't understand it. There were details that didn't make sense, names that meant nothing to him, and events he had no memory of. The deeper he read, the more confused he became. "This has to be a mistake," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm not involved in any of this." The man's gaze remained steady. "You'll have to explain that to the officers. They'd been briefed on your involvement in the case. You're not just some innocent bystander, Daniel. You've been connected to several criminal operations, and we need you to explain yourself." Daniel's mind was spinning. His head was full of questions, but none of them made sense. How could this be happening? He had nothing to do with any criminal activity. He was just an ordinary man, living an ordinary life. And now, somehow, his name was linked to a web of crime that he couldn't even begin to understand. He opened his mouth to speak again, but the man raised a hand, silencing him. "We'll see if your story checks out," the man said, standing up and gathering the folder. "Until then, we'll hold you for questioning. Don't bother trying to run. There's nowhere to go." Daniel felt his knees go weak. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He was trapped, and the truth, whatever it was, seemed farther away than ever. The room began to spin, and he felt his breath catch in his chest. His life, it seemed, had just become something unrecognizable, and he didn't know how to make it right. Daniel's mind was a storm of confusion and fear. His heart raced in his chest as he sat in the cold, dimly lit room, staring at the man who had just accused him of being involved in criminal activities. How could this be happening? The words echoed in his ears like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He had no connections to crime. He didn't even know how to get involved in anything illegal. The more he tried to understand what was going on, the more impossible it seemed. His fingers trembled as he clutched the paper the man had given him, feeling the weight of it in his hands like it was some terrible proof of his guilt. It was a list of names, people he didn't recognize, with his own name sitting at the top. There was no logical explanation for how his name had ended up there. Yet there it was. He had been connected to things he couldn't even begin to comprehend. The man in the suit had already walked out of the room, leaving Daniel alone to digest everything. The silence in the room felt thick, suffocating. The buzzing of the fluorescent light above seemed to grow louder, the air heavy with an oppressive sense of dread. He tried to steady his breathing, but his thoughts kept spiraling into chaos. How did they know his name? What evidence did they have against him? Were they planting false information to frame him? His stomach churned at the thought. But deep down, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this, something he wasn't seeing. A part of him wanted to scream, to shout that he was innocent, that this was all a mistake. But another part of him wondered if anyone would even believe him. How could he explain the impossible? How could he convince them that he was just a regular guy caught up in something far bigger than himself? The minutes seemed to drag on. He glanced at the door, hoping for someone, anyone, to come in and offer some answers. But it remained closed, and the longer he waited, the more isolated he felt. He had no one to turn to, no one to call. He didn't know who to trust anymore. Suddenly, the door opened, breaking the heavy silence. Daniel looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and dread. A different officer entered, this time a woman, wearing a dark uniform. Her expression was unreadable, her face neutral. She didn't offer him any words of reassurance, just a silent, authoritative look. "We need you to come with us," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. Daniel didn't move immediately. His mind was still reeling. What was happening? Why couldn't anyone give him a straight answer? "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice shaking with uncertainty. The officer didn't answer, only motioned for him to follow. He had no choice but to comply. As he stood up, his knees wobbled beneath him, and he struggled to steady himself. The fear and uncertainty had drained him, leaving him feeling weak and fragile. He walked toward the door, every step feeling like a heavy burden. It was as though he was walking deeper into a nightmare, and the further he went, the harder it was to wake up. The officer led him down another hallway, this one even darker and more claustrophobic than the last. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the air felt thick with the weight of what was happening. He couldn't help but wonder if he was being taken somewhere to be interrogated, or worse, somewhere they would make him disappear altogether. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. They stopped in front of another door, this one marked with a simple sign, "Interrogation Room." The officer opened the door and motioned for Daniel to enter. Inside, there was a large metal table in the center of the room, 2 chairs on either side. The room felt sterile, almost clinical, with harsh lighting that made everything feel more intense. It was a place designed to make people uncomfortable, to strip them of their dignity, to break them down. "Sit," the officer instructed coldly. Daniel obeyed, slowly lowering himself into the chair opposite the table. His hands were clammy, his body tense, and his heart felt like it might burst from his chest. He was afraid of the unknown, afraid of what they might do to him. And most of all, afraid of the possibility that they might be right. That somehow, despite everything he believed about himself, he was indeed involved in something terrible. A few minutes passed in silence. The officer, still standing, gave him no time to adjust to his surroundings. She simply watched him, her eyes sharp and unblinking, like she was waiting for him to crack under pressure. The tension was unbearable. Finally, the door opened again. This time, it was the man in the suit who entered. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he moved to the opposite side of the table, sitting down and unfolding the same folder from before. He placed it in front of Daniel, the papers inside rustling softly. "Do you know why you're here, Daniel?" the man asked again, his voice like ice. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He had no idea what to say anymore. Every explanation he tried to form felt hollow, useless. The truth seemed so far from his grasp that it was hard to even imagine. The man leaned forward, his gaze never leaving Daniel. "You are connected to an organization that we've been investigating for months. Your name keeps popping up, and the evidence points directly to you." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. "I don't know what you're talking about," he whispered, barely able to speak. "I'm not part of any organization. I swear." The man ignored his protest, instead sliding a picture across the table. Daniel hesitated before reaching out to take it. The photo was blurry, but he could make out two figures standing near an unmarked van, a street corner in the background. One of the figures looked vaguely familiar, but Daniel couldn't place them. His breath caught in his throat as he looked closer. "Do you recognize him?" the man asked, his voice low and dangerous. Daniel's mind raced. The figure in the photo looked like someone he had seen once before, a man who had passed him on the street a few weeks ago. But that was all. He didn't know him. He had never spoken to him, never interacted with him in any way. "I don't know him," Daniel said, his voice shaking. "I've never seen him before." The man narrowed his eyes. "This man is connected to a series of crimes. Your name was found in his phone. We have surveillance footage of you meeting with him. The evidence is overwhelming." Daniel's head swam. This was impossible. There was no way he could have met this man. He had never been involved in any crimes. Yet the evidence was right in front of him, and it painted a picture he couldn't deny. Or could he? Was this all a setup? Was someone framing him? The walls of the room seemed to close in around him, and for the first time, Daniel felt truly trapped. The weight of everything, the confusion, the fear, the hopelessness, crushed him. "I'm innocent," Daniel shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "I don't know anything about this. You've got the wrong guy." But the man's expression remained unchanged. "We'll see," he said coldly. "You have a lot of explaining to do, Daniel. And I suggest you start talking before this gets worse for you." Daniel's breath hitched, his throat dry. The terror that had been building inside him now threatened to consume him entirely. He didn't know how he could prove his innocence when everything seemed stacked against him. Was he truly guilty of something he couldn't remember? Or was there someone out there who had set him up, pushing him into a nightmare that he couldn't escape? The room felt smaller, the air thicker, and as the door closed behind the man, Daniel knew one thing for sure. He was now a pawn in a game he didn't understand, and he didn't know how to win. The hours bled into one another as Daniel sat in that interrogation room, the pressure mounting with every second. His throat was dry, his body aching from the stress of it all. The man in the suit had left, leaving him alone again, but the fear didn't dissipate. If anything, it grew stronger, gnawing at him from the inside out. The walls around him felt like they were closing in, and the silence seemed louder than ever. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, sending small shocks of irritation through his already frayed nerves. The room itself felt like a trap, and he was the prey, helpless and vulnerable. His mind spun wildly. How could this be happening? Why were they trying to pin something on him that he had no memory of? The name on the list, the blurry photo, the mysterious figure, everything felt like pieces of a puzzle he wasn't even sure he could solve. He thought back to the moment he had been arrested, to the way the officers had acted like they already knew everything about him. How had they gotten his name in the first place? Who had they been talking to? And why hadn't anyone explained what was really going on? The questions ate at him, but every answer seemed to lead to another question, a spiral of confusion that he couldn't escape. The door creaked open, and Daniel snapped his head up, his heart hammering in his chest. Another officer stepped inside, but it wasn't the woman from before or the man in the suit. This one looked different. His uniform was slightly more worn, his face lined with experience. His eyes were sharp, calculating, like someone who had seen things most people would never want to imagine. Without saying a word, the officer sat down across from Daniel. He didn't look at the folder, or even acknowledge the pile of documents that lay in front of him. His gaze was steady, unblinking. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. Daniel tried to swallow the lump in his throat, but it wouldn't go down. The silence felt oppressive, suffocating. He wanted to ask questions, but he didn't even know where to begin. Finally, the officer broke the silence. "I'm here to help you," he said, his voice calm and almost soothing. But there was something in his tone that didn't match his words. Something about the way he spoke felt rehearsed, calculated. Daniel wasn't sure if he could trust this man. Help him? How could anyone help him when everyone around him was convinced he was guilty of something he didn't even understand? Still, he had no choice but to listen. "What do you mean, help me?" Daniel asked, his voice hoarse. His thoughts were scrambled, and his mind raced with the idea that maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to make them understand. The officer leaned forward, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. "You've been caught up in something far bigger than you realize. The people who are behind this, they don't care about you. But I do. I'm trying to protect you." Daniel felt a flicker of hope. Someone was on his side. But that hope quickly turned to suspicion. What did he mean by protect me? "What's going on?" Daniel asked, desperate for answers. "Who are these people? Why is my name on that list? I don't know them. I don't know anything about any of this." The officer's expression remained neutral, but there was something in his eyes that made Daniel feel uneasy. "You've been swept into a conspiracy," he said quietly, as though he was speaking more to himself than to Daniel. "A group has been using innocent people as pawns in their operations. Your name just happened to come up. They're good at hiding their tracks, but we're starting to get closer. And you're in the middle of it." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. A conspiracy. He had been caught up in something bigger than himself. His mind reeled as he tried to make sense of the officer's words. The idea seemed impossible, but then again, everything happening to him felt impossible. "How do you know I'm not involved?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. He couldn't help it. The fear was too overwhelming. What if I'm just a part of their plan? What if they framed me for something I didn't do? The officer's gaze softened slightly, but his words were still stern. "I know you didn't do this, but they've put you in a position where you're going to have to make some difficult choices, and if you don't make the right ones, it's not just your freedom at risk." Daniel swallowed hard, trying to absorb the weight of what the officer was saying. Choices. Freedom at risk. The tension in his chest tightened, and his mind churned with possibilities. "Why should I trust you?" Daniel asked, his voice filled with doubt. "For all I know, you could be one of them. You could be just another part of the plan." The officer leaned back in his chair, looking at Daniel with something that might have been sympathy, or was it something else? He couldn't tell. "You don't have to trust me," he said, his voice lowering. But you do need to trust that if you don't take action soon, you're going to be dragged deeper into this than you can even imagine. You're already in over your head." Daniel's chest tightened at the officer's words. He wasn't sure who to trust anymore. Everyone had their own agenda. Everyone was playing a part in this twisted game, and he was just a pawn. He had no idea who was telling the truth or who was lying to him. The officer pushed the folder across the table, his finger pointing to a specific document. "This is your chance, Daniel. You have the ability to stop this, but it requires you to make a choice, to either fight back and expose the truth, or to walk away and let them win." Daniel stared at the paper, his eyes scanning the words in front of him. It didn't make sense. None of it did. But the officer's words rang in his ears, like an alarm bell. He had to make a choice. Fight or run. He thought about the life he had before this all started. He had been normal. He had been safe. Now, everything was upside down. And the longer he waited, the more it seemed like the walls were closing in. "I don't know what to do," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. He was at the breaking point, his mind reeling with fear, confusion, and anger. What if I make the wrong choice? The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he simply stood up and walked toward the door. Before he left, he turned back and looked Daniel in the eye. "The wrong choice will destroy you. Choose wisely." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Daniel alone in the sterile, cold room once again. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as the weight of what the officer had said sank in. He had no more time to waste. The clock was ticking, and the choice before him would determine everything. Daniel ran his fingers through his hair, his mind spinning. Fight or run? He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't stay here forever. He had to decide. And no matter what, his life would never be the same. Daniel's mind raced as the minutes ticked by in the interrogation room. The officer's words echoed in his ears, louder now than ever. "Choose wisely," he had said. "The wrong choice will destroy you." He sat there, frozen in the chair, unable to move. His hands trembled in his lap, and his chest felt tight, as though the weight of the world was pressing down on him. Every breath felt like a struggle, and every thought was tangled in confusion. The officer had given him a choice, fight or run. But how could he choose? How could he make a decision when the consequences of each were so unknown, so terrifying? Daniel glanced at the folder on the table, the papers inside still spread open, the words seemingly mocking him. His eyes traced the lines over and over again, but they all blurred together. He wanted answers, wanted clarity, but all he had were questions. So many questions. Who was behind this? Why was he involved? And most importantly, how could he fight an enemy he couldn't see? For the first time since all of this began, Daniel felt a glimmer of clarity. A small but undeniable truth began to surface. No matter what he chose, no matter how impossible it seemed, he could not remain passive any longer. He could not let these shadowy figures control his fate. He had to act. A quiet knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and before he could respond, it creaked open. The man in the suit stepped back inside, followed by the officer from earlier. This time, there was no attempt to mask the tension in the room. The man's eyes were sharp, almost triumphant, and the officer's expression was unreadable. "Daniel," the man said coldly, his voice smooth as ever, "we're getting closer to the truth. We know you're involved, and we're not going to let you walk away from this. Not now, not ever." Daniel's heart sank as the words sank in. This is it, his final chance. He could already feel the walls closing in around him again, the air growing heavier, thicker, suffocating. He couldn't run from this anymore. But should he fight back? Should he trust the officer who had told him to make a choice? Or was that just another part of their game? He clenched his fists. "I can't just sit here and wait to be crushed." The officer stepped forward and handed Daniel a folder of his own. "You're out of time. You'll either make your move now, or you'll become part of the system you're trying to escape. You know the stakes. The decision is yours. Daniel's mind flashed through everything he had learned so far. The mysterious figures, the threats, the cryptic warnings. But there was one thing that was becoming clear. He was running out of options. Suddenly, the door swung open once more. This time, it wasn't the officer or the man in the suit. It was a woman, and she was dressed in plain clothes. Her eyes locked onto Daniel's, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Daniel saw something familiar, something human in the stranger's gaze. She looked like someone who understood fear. And in that moment, he knew. He knew she was different. Without a word, she walked toward him, her movements quick and purposeful. She leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said. "You've got one chance. They don't know I'm here, but I can get you out. You have to trust me. You can't stay here. Not if you want to survive." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for, the one chance to break free from the web that had ensnared him. His heart pounded in his chest as he weighed his options, every second feeling like a lifetime. The man in the suit looked up at her, his expression turning to one of controlled fury. "What is this? Who are you?" The woman didn't flinch. She didn't even seem surprised. "You've been watching him for too long," she said, her voice unwavering. "Now it's my turn." Daniel's mind raced. Who was she? Why was she here? Was this the moment he had been waiting for? The chance to escape? Or was this just another trap? He couldn't think too much longer. "I can't go back." Daniel fought desperately. "I can't stay in this place. I can't let them control me. I have to choose." He stood up suddenly, his decision made. His heart was pounding, his hands shaking, but his voice was steady as he looked at the woman. "Let's go," he said, his words firm, though every part of him wanted to doubt. The woman gave him a brief nod, her eyes flashing with determination. She turned to walk toward the door. But just before she reached the exit, the officer lunged forward, his hand gripping her arm tightly. "You're making a mistake," he growled. "You think you can just walk away. You think you can change things." But the woman didn't hesitate. With one swift motion, she twisted her arm, breaking free from the officer's grip. "I'm not asking for your permission," she said coldly, her voice unshaken. Daniel's pulse raced. This was it. There was no going back. The decision had been made. He wasn't going to let fear or uncertainty dictate his life any longer. He was going to take control of his own fate, even if it meant running headfirst into the unknown. As the woman moved to open the door, Daniel turned one last time, glancing at the man in the suit, who stood silently behind the table. For a moment, their eyes met. No words were exchanged, but it was as if Daniel could feel the weight of the unspoken promise. This was the last time they would meet like this. One way or another, everything was going to change. Without another word, Daniel followed the woman, stepping through the door and into the unknown. The moment it shut behind them, he heard the echo of footsteps as they ran down the hall, the sound of his heart racing in his chest. He didn't know where they were going. He didn't know what would happen next. But in that moment, Daniel knew one thing. He was free. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt the hope of possibility. The hope that he might just survive this nightmare after all.